Good evening. France has begun removing its troops from Chad after the former French colony announced that it was ending its decades-long military alliance with France. Well, the move is the latest blow to France's declining influence in its former colonies, particularly in West Africa. The decision follows similar moves in Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger after a wave of coups since 2020 where France was accused of interference. Well, tonight we visit 3 different continents to explore the geopolitical consequences of reparations, reconciliation and the return of stolen treasures. But first, AnewZ's Ajek Mangal sent this report from Nigeria.
Guy, the withdrawal of French troops kicked off with the departure of 2 warplanes that were based in the capital, N'Djamena, according to the French army, adding that it marks the beginning of the return of French equipment stationed in N'Djamena. There are about 1,000 troops in the Central African nation, and the French army says it could take several weeks for both countries to finalize the withdrawal process. The Chadian army spokesperson also said that the public would be informed of the withdrawal until the definitive departure of the French forces. Chadian Foreign Minister had earlier said that the country remains determined to maintain constructive relations with France in other areas of common interest for the benefit of both peoples. But it's not yet clear what that partnership or cooperation would look like. The move by Chad comes just as Senegal also asked France to close its military bases in the West African country, saying that allowing French bases was incompatible with its national sovereignty. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye said it was unbecoming for French troops to continue having a presence in Senegal, where 350 soldiers are currently based. France has operated military bases in the Sahel region for years, helping in the region's fight against jihadists that have terrorized and killed thousands while displacing millions. This move by Chad and Senegal is part of a wave of anti-French sentiments spurred by military coups in its former colonies in West Africa. The shift away from France began with the military takeovers of governments that were strong allies of France in Mali and Burkina Faso between 2020 and 2022. But the July 2023 coup in Niger seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back. These countries have all asked France to withdraw its troops as well, accusing the former colonial power of fueling destabilization in the region. Last year, Niger military coup leaders accused France of breaching its airspace, training, equipping and funding terrorist groups with the aim of attacking and destabilizing the country. France, however, denies these allegations. In 2022, Mali also accused France of sending weapons to armed groups in the country, an allegation France also denied. Earlier this year, the military junta in Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso formed an alliance with Russia, and Russian mercenaries have been deployed to help the military tackle their security challenges. The withdrawal of troops from Chad will end years of French military presence in the Sahel region and its contribution to the fight against Islamic militants. There are concerns, however, about what this means for the fight against insecurity in the Sahel region. Ajek Mangut for AnewZ in Abuja.
So as African countries recalibrate old relationships, new economic and diplomatic opportunities emerge. AnewZ's Ali Sultan Sultanzada takes a look now at how relationships across the continent are changing.
Another chapter in the Indo-Chinese struggle is ended as...
For over 2 centuries, French colonial rule shaped Africa's politics, economy and culture. Independence movements in the mid-20th century ended direct colonial rule, but France retained influence through economic agreements, military cooperation and the CFA franc. In recent years, African nations have distanced themselves from France. Rising anti-French sentiment has led to the expulsion of French troops from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger and now Chad. Senegal has also requested their departure. Chad's leader Mohamed Idriss Déby is forging ties with Russia and the United Arab Emirates, reflecting a broader rejection of colonial-era relationships. Meanwhile, nations like Mali and Burkina Faso have turned to Russian security forces, while China expands its footprint with major infrastructure projects.
African countries can conduct intra-regional trade on a massive scale.
Africa is experiencing robust economic growth. The African Development Bank reports that 11 of the world's 20 fastest-growing economies in 2024 will be African, led by Nigeria 11.2%, Senegal 8.2%, and Rwanda 7.2%. Ghana has also emerged as a prominent economic player, attracting investments in sectors like energy, agriculture, and digital technology. The continent's projected GDP growth 3.8% in 2024 and 4.2% in 2025 will surpass global average and make Africa the second fastest growing region after Asia. Rwanda and Ghana exemplify Africa's strategic diversification, serving as gateways for investments including from GCC countries. France's withdrawal from Chad symbolizes the end of an era. African nations are building diversified partnerships, leveraging economic growth and asserting sovereignty. As ties with Russia, China, the US, and GCC countries deepen, the continent is charting a path towards greater resilience and autonomy.
Well, as we heard there, one of the African countries battling to move forward from its colonial past is Ghana. Our reporter Nabil Ahmed Rifai reports from the capital Accra on how newly elected President Mahama is getting to grips with the worst economic crisis in a generation, all against a backdrop of the effects of colonialization.
Guy calls for African countries to be compensated for the exploitation by former colonizers are growing louder. In October, 56 heads of government, including the UK Prime Minister, met at a summit in Samoa and discussed the calls for reparations. The UK said it would not pay reparations, while acknowledging that discussions about reparatory justice can take place. Already, Ghana has received some of its stolen treasures, which were being kept in an American museum after they were looted more than a century ago. The UK has also returned more than 30 of the stolen artifacts to Ghana's Ashanti region on a loan deal. It all comes as Western nations face mounting pressure to return artifacts stolen during colonial rule. As Africans try to reconcile with the atrocities committed against them in the past, they hope the gradual return of their treasures will be part of their healing process. In 2019, Ghana initiated the Year of Return campaign with a call for Africans living overseas to come home. It was part of the commemoration of 400 years since the first African slaves stepped foot in America. Since then, African Americans and those living in the diaspora have visited Ghana in increasing numbers in a bid to learn more about their history. Ghana went to the polls on Saturday and elected its former president, John Mahama, to govern the West African nation again for a 4-year term starting from next year. John Mahama came up against the current Vice President Mahamudu Bawumia of the ruling New Patriotic Party. He won the polls with nearly 57% of the votes cast, while the Vice President obtained a little over 41%. The ruling government and President-elect John Mahama have formed a joint transition team who will see to the peaceful transfer of power. Ghana is facing its worst crisis in decades, with high inflation and a weakening currency. John Mahama faces a tough time of turning the country's economy around in the next 4 years. Nabil Ahmed Rufai for AnewZ, Accra, Ghana.
Well, according to the Prosper Africa initiative, since 2021, the US government has closed over 1,000 deals valued at $63 billion in 41 African countries. Well, let's speak to our man in Washington now, Obey Shabanda, to explore the battle for bilateral relationships with Africa's fastest growing countries. Obey, good to see you as always. Let's start by getting the view from Washington on this situation that's been occurring in Chad.
Yeah, that's right. Just merely a week after the government of Chad abruptly canceled its defense cooperation agreement with France, French forces have begun withdrawing from yet another sub-Saharan African country, with Chad follows Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, all these countries that were formerly in the so-called French sphere of influence, an area where France has a sordid colonial past, have all told France it's time to pack your bags and send your soldiers back home. This is a significant military development because this is an area in the sub-Saharan part of Africa where the French have maintained a military presence for decades in areas in French-speaking, the Francophone parts of the Sahel region of Africa that were once under either the direct colonial rule or indirect colonial rule of France, are areas that the French military have maintained military bases as part of Paris's attempts to project itself as a global power. But there has been a backlash. These countries say that the French military is not really doing its purported role, which is to train and work with local forces as part of a counter-terror mission. So it is telling that Chad follows these other countries in the recent years that have essentially told Paris that they've had enough and that they want to turn a new chapter to go beyond the French colonial influence. Now, how will this impact the counterterrorism fight in the region? That remains to be seen, but it certainly is a sign from the defense forces of the French-speaking parts of the Sahel region of Africa that they want to chart a new path of independence, one that is not beholden to the French colonial past. And these, the fact that these defense cooperation agreements were being used by Paris to project influence in these areas, I think was one big factor in these countries essentially ripping apart these agreements and telling French forces that they have no longer any legitimacy to maintain troops in their countries.
The military freedom, the disentanglement from other nations when it comes to the military side of things, Obey, is very important. But also, there's this strong sense of economic freedom. We heard in Ali Sultan's report there about the growing prosperity across the continent. What's Washington's view when it comes to building future economic relationships with African countries?
Well, it's interesting because these are the same areas where the American military also once had a presence, but have been told by the Sahel countries to also pack up their forces and leave. One of the largest American drone bases was in Mali and in Niger, and those defense agreements have also been essentially rendered null and void by the military forces of those countries. So it's not only France, but we're seeing this trend in the Sahel region to really chart a path of independence, whereas Western military forces that have these sprawling military bases, air bases and drone bases where they launch drone strikes, have been essentially told that they can no longer operate with impunity in those countries, or as part of a defense security cooperation agreements that essentially provide the framework for countries like France and for the US to establish these massive military bases. So now both the French forces are leaving, American forces have also left in Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali. And so I think this is probably fits into the wider trend of these countries to chart a path of economic and military independence. It's really interconnected, because when you have a massive foreign military base on your soil, that comes with a significant amount of influence, of pressure, and is believed by many of these African countries and African analysts to be really a tool by Western governments to sort of impose their geopolitical interests on these countries. So I think on one hand, we've seen both Washington and Paris, abide by this new vision by the Sahel countries and the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa to tell the American forces and the French forces, hey, thank you so much, but now we can take on this fight on our own. We want relations as equals. We want mutual respect, where as we focus on economic trade rather than the old blueprint where Western military forces had these massive military bases and essentially treated the former colonial countries in the Sahel as sort of second-class states. So I think this is really significant because now this is really, in the end, it can chart a new sort of paradigm for the Sahel region, whereas they're not just used as pawns for their natural resources, but can operate as a country, as a sovereign country, and have mutual respect with these major Western powers.
And Obey, in this new paradigm, we know that quite a lot of anti-French sentiment has been there across many of these countries. And to what extent do you think that other nations, China, Russia, and of course the US, can capitalize on that desire to look towards other partners, in some senses, anyone but France?
Yeah, certainly. I think you're already seeing Russia and China, Moscow and Beijing attempting to fill that void left by the French military departure and by the American military departure in these areas in sub-Saharan Africa. Look, there is still a major terror threat in the region. You've got Boko Haram on the march across multiple countries in Western Africa. You have an Al-Qaeda offshoot that has been making a resurgence in the Sahel region. So you're going to certainly see other countries like China with this Belt and Road Initiative that is very active across Africa, particularly Eastern Africa, try to make inroads into these areas the French are vacating. Look, we're looking at decades of French military presence that has now essentially come to an end very swiftly in the preceding years. And it's, when you look at, it's not just an agreement between two countries' militaries that is coming to an end. If you look at the popular response in countries like Chad, the people are lining up the streets. They're cheering as the French military vehicles are withdrawing and going to the airfield to leave their country. So I think this is also a reflection of a wider popular sentiment in the Sahel region that, frankly, it's not just the militaries or the governments of these countries that want the French to leave, but also the people, a wider popular sentiment in places like Chad, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And for the Americans, it means that, well, okay, we no longer have drone bases there, but we can at least establish bilateral relations and try to empower a local force there that can operate independently. So the question is that, will these countries be able to pursue the counter-terror fight as sovereign countries? That is the question here. But what is clear is that countries like Chad and Niger and Burkina Faso are saying, look, we are not benefiting from this foreign Western military presence here. We can take this fight on our own. But at the same time, the Russian forces, the revamped Wagner forces, are also operating in Africa, and you can certainly look to Beijing to try to make inroads in areas that the French are retreating from in Africa.
And Obey, finally, what are you hearing in Washington about President-elect Trump and his team and the future vision for opportunities that may exist in African countries between them and the US?
Well, for President Trump's foreign policy vision, it's America first, but working with countries out on a sovereign level where mutual prosperity is the operative word here. And we've seen that vision laid out by President Trump and his team, where they believe that, look, if there's a win-win situation where a trade agreement can be signed between the United States and other countries, you don't have to agree on everything, and you don't need a prolonged military presence or an American military intervention all across the world. So that America First foreign policy is going to mean less military intervention overseas. And that, I think, is going to really be received positively in African countries that want trade with the US, not sort of this rapacious agreements with other Western countries that only sought to extract the natural resources of African countries that are rich in natural resources that are needed by manufacturers in the West, but to establish mutual understandings based on mutual benefits. And that is where trade agreements can come in. And President Trump, as we know, his foreign policy is really going to be based on foreign trade agreements that benefit the United States, but also benefit the other countries on the other end. So I think that mutual respect, a foreign policy that is opposed to intervention across the globe, no longer being the world's policeman, I think will also be received very well in African capitals.
Obey, great to hear you, great to see you as always. Thank you very much. Obey Sharbanda there in Washington for us. Well, that is all we have time for tonight on NewsHour. Thank you very much for watching. Please do stay tuned to AnewZ for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here on the team, we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.